Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this, the first of our HESES24 training events. And if we can have the next slide, please, we will run through some housekeeping. Thank you. So my name is Roger Lear, and I work as the funding officer in the funding team at the OFS. My link goes down. My colleague Will Howard will step in to take over from me. And in a moment, we'll be joined by my colleague Ross Lawler, the head of funding operations at the OFS. So in terms of using Zoom, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, but we'll just run through this quickly. We've turned on the live transcription feature in Zoom, so captions are available by clicking on the CC icon. And those are, of course, automatically generated. So unfortunately, our jargon might cause one or two translation errors there. So I'm sorry, there's not a lot we can do about that. The event is being recorded, and you'll be able to see that via the event pages of our website in a couple of days' time once that's sorted out. And I'll show you the link for that page shortly. The intended audience for this session is very much those that have come across HESES before. So if you are new to HESES, by all means stick around, but we have other webinars starting next week, details of which can also be found on our events page, which you will see shortly. Questions. So thank you to those who have already submitted questions in advance of this event. We'll incorporate those into the Q&A part of the session. We're also happy to receive your questions during the event. Please can I ask you to use the Q&A box, not the chat box for that. The chat box is for you to communicate with our events team if you need to. And in terms of feedback, we love to have your feedback. So for those that have agreed to take part in an evaluation survey when you registered, we'll be sending that to you after all of the HESES events have finished. But if you want to, you can write to us separately with an email address I'm about to give you to let us have what your thoughts might be. So can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Well, in a moment, Ross will be here to give his presentation on the main changes in HESES and HESES24, and then we will go on to those questions. We'll keep the scope of the questions to HESES24 and the changes to it and related policy issues, and we'll try to batch together common themes and issues. So you may not hear your exact question read out the way you typed it in, but we will try to make sure that all questions are answered. And if we miss anything, do please let us know. If a response looks like it's likely to be particularly lengthy or complex, we may suggest taking that discussion offline if that's appropriate. And it's something that you can always do. And here is that email address I was just talking about, HESES, HESES at officeforstudents.org.uk. I will actually read out all these addresses and web addresses because I know there are people who rely just on the audio in these presentations. So the next slide, please. Okay, as usual, we are publishing supporting materials for HESES. They don't all arrive at once, but we'll come to that in a second. These resources will include the recording of events like this, and when it's ready, you can get that via the events page on the OFS website, and you see the address there, officeforstudents.org.uk/events, and we'll also put the slides up there that we've been using today. Generally, the best starting point to find HESES resources is the main HESES webpage, officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES. And I think my colleagues will probably be able to put those two links in the chat box for your convenience. We will update that HESES page more and more as we get towards the release of the workbooks, but we'll be publishing things like the guidance document, which I'll come on to in a moment. So check back there frequently to see how things change as we get closer and closer to the start of the main event. So they'll be including things like model HESES workbooks. I noticed a typo on the screen, apologies for that. There will also be this publication called How to Complete the HESES24 Workbook publication, which will take you step by step, row by row through the workbook, showing you what goes where. But your main resource is likely to be the HESES24 guidance document, and we're expecting that to be published next week. It's just going through the final stages of approvals. And there will also be another book, another publication which you'll find useful, the HESES24 Multiplication Factors Representation Process publication, which is a real mouthful. And you'll find out more about multiplication factors and what we're doing with those this year in a moment when Ross tells you about that change. Finally, if you're looking for a more general overview of the OFS funding model, the guide to funding is a place to go. It is already out there. It's got a horrendously long URL, which I'm not going to attempt to replicate or read. The best thing to do is to go to our main website and search for its publication number, which you can see there, OFS 2024.35 in the search box, or just search Guide to Funding and you should find it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I think that's all the housekeeping that I want to do with everybody at the moment. So I think at this point, we can hand over to Ross. So Ross, are you there?
Yes, thank you, Roger. Welcome everybody to this, the first of our webinars for this year. It's always a sign that autumn is on us when my daughter goes back to school. I have to dust off my presentation skills for this. And also I did see mince pies on sale in Sainsbury's this morning. So it's definitely into autumn and HESES time. So we are going to be going through the changes to HESES for this year. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. I may have managed to change my view so I can't see that coming across. So I'm only seeing Roger's screen, so I may have to try and sort myself out with that in a bit, but I will try and keep track of which slides we are on. And talk through the slides where we are. If it looks like I am talking about the wrong slide, Roger, please interrupt me, and then we can make sure that I catch up again. So today we are going to be covering a number of changes that we're looking at for this year. We're going to be covering some changes to the student support regulations, some comparatively small changes. We have a detail that is of particular relevance to further education colleges and sixth form academies only, which is to do with the assignment of LDCS or HECOS codes to learning aims, how those describe the subjects over the course that's being taught. We are going to go on and talk about the 24-25 HESES workbook and collection verification process, and how we are going to be using multiplication factors to derive FTEs for funding for the upcoming academic year. Most of what we're talking about today has already been announced in the notification of changes document that we published on the 29th of July. The official title is Change to 2024 Student Data Surveys to Inform Funding. That is available from the publication section of our website, and the document number is 2024.37. If I'm very lucky in the background when I'm talking about this, one of the helpful team will be able to put a link to that in the chat. Could I have the next slide, please? So, student support regulations, effectively, we were not really telling you of any particular changes to this. Our definition in HESES of the residential fee status and fundability status of students remains unchanged, in that it is defined with reference to the student support regulations. As we always say, we are not the definitive body to decide what the fee status is for a particular student. We recommend you obviously talk to the SLC about that. But we are aware that there have been some changes to those legislations for this year. There is an information note published by the SLC, which can be found at the SLC's website. So the address for that is www.practitioners.slc.co.uk/policy. If you haven't had come across that website before, and there is a note there that summarises these changes. Most of them are relatively minor, but there is one that we wanted to highlight today, and that we highlighted in the notification of changes document, which is that students who are gaining settled status partway through their course will become eligible for student support for the rest of their course. So you might have a student who was recorded as international status, overseas status last year, but has achieved settled status since that point, and would be home fee status for this year. And if there is any students that are in that position who have that change of fee status, that is fine. Effectively, what we just want to do here is just to remind you about being aware of those changes and that fee status should be assessed each year. Could we move on to the next slide, please? So hopefully you're seeing my now traditional cat picture on these on these slides. Roger will buzz me if that's not true. So this is one of the second of these changes that we wanted to highlight. This is specific to, as I said, further education colleges. This is a recent change, which is why it was not mentioned in the notification of changes publication. What we are now aware of is that from 24-25, the ESFA has introduced HECOS codes to the Learning Aims database that they maintain. We will be using that in our HESES24 workbook. So providers, colleges, should be using HECOS codes to identify the price groups for your students for your courses. HECOS codes are like LDCS codes. They are used to describe the subject of the course that you're running. You can find information on the HECOS codes assigned to a particular learning aim from the ESFA's Find a Learning Aim service. We will be using that information when we construct the HESES24 courses table as well. And you can then use that when you are assigning your column 2 students, which of course you won't be able to complete through the courses table. So we don't expect this to have a hugely significant effect on your courses. We are aware of a couple of courses where there may be some changes to price groups. There is information that will be published in the guidance about this. If you think that there are any misclassifications, there is instructions there about what to do in terms of contacting the ESFA, letting us know, and how we can try to resolve any clashes. Could I have the next slide, please? So the basics for HESES24, the submission deadline is roughly in line with how we've had it previously. It'll be the 13th of November for further education colleges, the 11th of December for all other providers. So that's when you have to submit the workbook to us. And the sign-off deadline for your HESES data will be the 31st of January 2025 for all providers. The guidance, as we've said, is due to be published next week. We have, of course, some beginners webinars that Roger's mentioned and that we will be mentioning again, I'm sure, at the end, running over the next couple of weeks. So if you have, if you would like a refresher on any of the methods and definitions that you need to use to complete HESES, or if you have any colleagues that would benefit from that, please sign up for the webinars. And as Roger said, they will be also be available as recordings after the event as well. The key changes for HESES24, other than the ones we mentioned, are that, or the key points, I suppose, for HESES24, is that the HESES data tables will be remaining the same as last year. But what we will be doing for this year is that we are going to be including additional tables that will be included within the larger HESES workbook that will show the multiplication factors for your provider. So last year we had 2 separate processes effectively that ran for one for HESES and one for the multiplication factors that we used. So if I could have the next slide, please. So when we did around the 2 separate processes last year, we ran HESES first and signed off all the data. We, of course, had a bit of a protracted HESES process last year because of the delays caused by the data futures issues. We then, after that, ran a separate multiplication factors process, which we used to take your HESES data and convert it into the FTEs that we would use to calculate your funding allocations for 24-25. We had a representations process, which we ran, where you were able to make representations if you didn't agree with the multiplication factors, which meant that by the time we had agreed those multiplication factors, it was June, and we were making our funding allocations in July. Could I have the next slide, please? So the intention for this year is that we will be trying to combine the 2 processes together to a degree, or at least what we are doing is we're making the multiplication factors data available to you a lot earlier. We are doing this because we think this will minimize the burden that we're placing on you, in that we are giving you longer time to be able to consider any multiplication factors. We are only using the one submission process to enable any representations to be made at the same time as we're going through the HESES data. We are providing additional time to make the multiplication factors, so we are not completely just combining everything into one process. So the intention will be that we will release the workbooks to the normal schedule in late October. The census dates remain the same. The submission deadlines, as I mentioned previously, will be roughly in line with how they were in the middle of November and the middle of December, and HESES data will be signed off by the end of January. We are then going to be having a 2-week period after that, where we will be keeping the HESES part of the portal open, perhaps in a slightly different form to allow you to make any representations. And the representations can be made by submitting a copy of the HESES workbook through the portal. So you will get your workbook. The way we're conceiving of this is that you will then be able to go into the workbook, add your HESES data, submit that to go through the verification process. We will agree it, sign it off. You will then have a couple of extra weeks to make any to finalize your representations. We will then be able to consider those representations by the end of February. We will be able to then produce a final set of FTEs to inform funding for the 25-26 academic year in early March, so before the end of the financial year. That is the timing that we are intending to work towards. Could I have the next slide, please? So just summarizing then what that process is, we are intending that the HESES data tables and the comparison tables which we will use for HESES data verification will remain the same as last year. We're not making any changes to those structures. These additional tables that we are introducing will show the multiplication factors for your provider. They will show the FTEs that result when those multiplication factors are applied to the HESES data that you enter into that workbook. So you'll be able to enter in your HESES data and see how that will be converted across to funding FTEs. We will have tables that will show the indicative funding for those FTEs, but you should bear in mind a note of caution on that, in much the same way as we've had financial tables in previous versions of HESES, in that funding is indicative only. It is taking the current years, so 24-25 funding methods, and applying the new funding FTEs to those same methods. We, of course, don't yet know what the strategic guidance letter that we get from DFE will tell us in terms of how much money is available to us, and we have not made any decisions about any changes to funding methods that might need to result from that. So the indicative funding is there. Providers are often told it's helpful for planning purposes, but it's not something that you can then hold us to when we actually do release your funding allocations. So these additional tables will allow you to identify where multiplication factors don't accurately represent your provider's provision for this academic year, for the 24-25 academic year. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is just kind of a summary. This is the one workbook, two purposes slide. As I said, I can't actually see what's being displayed through the webinar. So could we move on to the next slide, please, which should have a summary diagram for how multiplication factors inform funding. So this slide and the next slide are just something where I wanted to just give people a recap of how we use these multiplication factors. So HESES, in our current form that we are using, records years of engagement. So it's not dissimilar to a head count in that we are recording how many years, how many student years are actually of study are going on in your provider. They're categorized by mode, level, and price group, of course, in the same way that we've historically done for HESES. But that HESES data doesn't reflect the study intensity of part-time students, and it doesn't reflect the historical rates of non-completion that we have used in our funding method. So when we introduced multiplication factors last year, it was because we could not, because of the change to data futures, the non-completion rates were something that we didn't think it was possible to. We didn't want to ask providers to be recording that in HESES anymore because it was not data that was being recorded in the DDB student record. So that idea of non-completion, fund comp, the old HESES student field, was not being recorded any longer. We still needed to maintain that link to non-completion. So we introduced this idea of multiplication factors to combine to contain that data. So multiplication factors are timesed by the number of years of engagement within HESES to calculate the FTEs that we will use to inform funding. Could we have the next slide, please? So with the multiplication factors for 23-24 provisions, so that they were applied to so I applied to your HESES 23 data. Sorry, I do realize that sometimes this can be complicated. I had to just make sure I had the right year in my head then. So we applied last year, we took your HESES 23 data and we applied multiplication factors to them. We then used that to calculate the FTEs that we used to inform your 24-25 funding. Those multiplication factors that we first showed you in March this year, actually, I do apologize, March earlier this year, were calculated specifically for your provider by looking at historical data. So we looked at the HESES 22 data, and we used that to work out a multiplication factor for each line within the HESES workbook. So for each combination of mode, level, price group, length of year, etc. So we used those to calculate individual multiplication factors, and the ones that we showed you would either have been calculated based on specific data to your provider, that would be the case if we had sufficient numbers of students to be satisfied that the multiplication factor shown was accurate, or if we didn't think that was the case, if there was only a few students that we could use to calculate a multiplication factor, we may have gone upwards within your provider. So we may have aggregated upwards perhaps to the level of all undergraduates, or we might have aggregated even further upwards and used sector data instead. So last year, we showed you those multiplication factors in March. We ran we ran a representations process in May, and in June 2024, those multiplication factors were agreed as representative of the 23-24 provision. So either you would have seen them, you would have made a representation, representation may have been considered neither accepted or rejected, or no representation was made, and effectively all factors were then agreed as being representative of that year. For this year, we are not going to be recalculating all of those multiplication factors afresh. Our starting point is the multiplication factors agreed as representative for last year are our starting point. If you have any new provision, so for example, you've started to run engineering courses where you did not have anything in that price group before, we will be using a multiplication factor derived from HESES 22 data. But if you've agreed them from last year, then we won't need to do that. Could I have the next slide, please? So we will have this set, we already have this set of agreed multiplication factors, which represents the close of the position from June this year. We will start from that position. There will still be a representations process this year where you can tell us if you think that a multiplication factor needs to be amended. The idea here is that we want the multiplication factors to reflect as closely as possible your 24-25 provision. So if you've got new courses which have started, which may mean that they need to be changed, we would want to know about it. If we are using a multiplication factor for your part-time provision and you change the way that you deliver that provision, say you've moved from it being a 6-year, typically being a 3-year course over 6 years to being a 3-year course over 4 years, so the intensity of study has changed quite considerably, we would want to make sure that the multiplication factor changes to represent that. So if you want to make those representations, you'll be entering them onto the relevant tabs, the relevant worksheets within the HESES workbook. When you upload that workbook to the OFS portal, it will read in any representations that you have recorded on those worksheets. There's no limit to the number of times that you can make those uploads. So as you're going through the HESES process, you may upload several different versions when you're making your initial submissions. You may upload several different versions if you're making changes to the data during the verification process. And you may make a couple of uploads after the HESES data is signed off, but before the deadline in the middle of February for the representations process, for any representations to be closed off. However many you upload, we will take the most recent version of the workbook on the 14th of February to identify the representations you want to make. So if you identify that you need to make a representation to, say, account for a new course on the 15th of January, and you put that into your workbook, you upload it to the portal, that's fine. What you should not then do is to remove that and expect us to still see it. So we need to make sure that on the 14th of February, the most recent version of the workbook that you've uploaded contains everything you want us to consider. As I said, they can be uploaded at any point. We won't be reviewing the representations themselves until after the HESES verification window closes. So we won't really be doing much with this in terms of getting into the details of the representations until we hit February. That's as much as anything because we want to focus on making sure that the HESES data is accurate. So we're sort of considering it in those two steps, HESES first, and then we'll move on to the multiplication factors. How you manage this will obviously depend on your staff availability in your provider. We have a sort of loose recommendation that we think it might be helpful to upload your workbook with your final representations after the 31st of January, or at the very least, you should review the workbook at that point. What we want to do is make sure that we don't inadvertently, or nobody inadvertently misses any representations that they want to make. So I think that brings us to the close of my planned slides. If you could move on to the next slide, please. I think that'll be the Q&A slide. So I'm going to pass back to my colleague, Roger, who will be looking at the questions that have been collated and will tell me what we need to talk about.
Yes, thank you, Ross. And as you say, while you've been speaking, the questions have been coming in. We're having some difficulty today. My screen has just gone blank. So if you will just bear with me while I organize the other one, and I will be able to I'm sorry, everybody. This is exactly the wrong moment for hardware problems. So bear with me for just one moment, please, and I'll see if I can get things back. That's better. Yes, apologies. So let me see if I can find the questions, because as you were saying, Ross, a number of questions have come in, and let me find the right place. Some of which are related to what you've been talking about, others not. So we'll start by going back to what you were saying to us about the LARS related changes and LDCS codes. So these are no longer being used to map courses in the ILR. Instead, they're going to be HESES codes. They're recorded on LARS ahead of HESES. Question was, are these actually going to appear on LARS? I think somebody put in a link to show that they'd actually looked up something on the FALAR website and found that it didn't actually show anything. So this is probably one for our colleagues who are a little more active in the ESFA space than us, but I don't know if you have anything on that.
No, but I do have a note from from people in the data directorate who are supporting our webinar today. So the note that we have is that we're expecting to be on the LARS downloads tomorrow. Not sure yet if when HECOS will be displayed on the Learning Aims search. So there is the search, the live web pages. There is also a download that you can take from the of the data containing within that. It's certainly something that we will use. So we are expecting it to show there, even if it is not on the actual live pages yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Hope that answers that one. Also in this neck of the woods, a question about how to handle knowledge and skills lines in higher apprenticeships where the learning aid reference is a Z code. So I think this is again sort of territory of the ILR. So yeah, so if you say something on that, Ross.
Yeah, again, I am very much leaning on my colleagues' advice on this. So this was a question that we had pre-submitted, which was very helpful. I've got to say, we did have a number of questions that came in advance of the webinar, and it's been very helpful to be able to get an idea of how we want to pitch this and what would be helpful to provide information on. So the note that we've had on this is that we don't currently treat Z lines as recognised higher education for the purposes of recording in HESES. Or the HESES recreation. Generally, that's because they don't really represent qualifications that are recognised for higher education in themselves. I think my understanding, and I'm happy to be corrected as being wrong here, is that Z codes tend to be more around, as the question said, they're more around sort of the more general skills, I think would be a way of sort of thinking about it, and less about the specific knowledge that you might need for, say, an HNC or an HND. So not included is effectively the summary of that.
Okay. So on to multiplication factors. We may there may be other questions which come in on those kinds of issues, and we can come back to them. But looking at multiplication factors, and I think you may have covered some of this ground already, but it's probably worth going over again for people's benefit. So first question here is, will the multiplication factors take account of recent data, or will they still be using HESES24 rates? Well, I think you've talked about that, but if you want to reiterate that a little further.
Yes, so they are we're not thinking of them as still using HESES22 rates, though in many cases that's where they were originally calculated from. We can't do a recalculation process and use them off more recent data because we don't effectively have that. The HESES23 data that we collected last year was using the new was reflecting the new format, the new way that data is recorded in under the data future specification. So we don't have the two parts that we would need to use to calculate the multiplication factors. They aren't completely just using HESES22 data, because where we had representations last year that were accepted, they will reflect that agreed position afterwards.
Okay, thank you. I noticed one comment from somebody saying that they're pleased to have the multiplication factors together in the workbook, which will help reduce burden. So we're glad to hear that that's how people are seeing that. And also moving on here to multiplication factors, the question is, are the rules for making representations to change one of the multiplication factors the same as noted in March 23? For example, as a predicted change to funding based on the indicative funding tables that you talked about within the workbook of at least, I think it was £100,000, or result in a predicted change to funding based on a percentage of the provider's total funding allocation.
I think it's probably helpful to check the final version that we're going to be publishing next week. I don't have that text in front of me, and I don't think you want to say what me hunting for it for 5 minutes. So we have been reviewing the criteria that we put in place. So I don't think, for example, that necessarily reflects these changes around that you've asked about are more around the indicative funding aspect of it. But another part of that is around the minimum changes to the multiplication factor that we would accept. So we said last year that we wouldn't accept a indicative change to the factor that was less than 0.05, so 5%. We have tweaked that a bit for this year, reflecting the feedback we had from we received from providers from last year's process. So we are operating on a slightly smaller acceptable multiplication factor change for provision in price group A, for example, because of the significant amount of funding that is attached to that, and the type of courses that tend to run in that, the clinical courses that run in price group A. So those are broadly what we're looking at, but I would very much say check the guidance when it's fully published, digest it, and then if you have any questions, please come back to us at that point.
Yeah, I think the question was sort of largely perhaps two sides to the question, which are one, are the rules going to be similar to last year in the sense that they're either a monetary or percentage basis, and then secondly, what were likely to be the changes, if any, to the figures. So that last part is linked to another question on this, which suggests that there would be a minimum threshold in order to meet the threshold for accept or considering a representation. And as you've said, that's something which is still to be finalized. The question is, last time one provider missed that narrowly, and they're concerned that they may do again, and are ultimately therefore concerned about the potential for a sizable loss of funding over more than 1 year. So the question is, wouldn't you use the latest full-time equivalent data from the HESES recreation?
So I think there's a couple of things to bring out from that. So we are using minimum thresholds. Is probably one thing just as well I didn't mention previously. Where you have that sort of idea about you've just missed out on the threshold maybe a couple of years running, we are open to the argument that you might want to make that I guess you're considering, this comes back to the point about whether you're considering if how much the multiplication factor represents your provision for this year. So if you are wanting to make the argument that the provision has changed significantly over the last couple of years, we would be open to that. But part of this is that you have to be able to make that narrative around it being a significant change. So we want to know what is significantly different about the provision. So we're thinking about trying to make sure that we are capturing new courses that have closed, courses that have had significant changes to the way that they're run is the sort of thing we're trying to capture from this. But it is something that we are open to that possibility of smaller changes over a long time building up. So you might have had maybe one course that closed last year that didn't quite meet the threshold, and maybe another small course that closed this year, but cumulatively that might have met the threshold. We will listen to that argument if you can make it that way to us, but it should be around that idea of a significant change. Separate part I wanted to draw out was that last question around using the latest FTE from the HESES recreation. So this kind of feeds into our broader expectations for what we want to do with funding. So you may have seen that we ran a call for evidence on funding effectively over the spring and the summer. The intention is that we are going to be going out with publishing a document that summarizes the results of that. What providers and other respondent sector groups have actually told us in early October. We will be using that as to inform our broader ambitions to do a larger scale review of our funding methods. We are looking to do some sort of consultation in January, well, not January, sorry, in early 2025. We're still shaping what that will look like. There's still a lot of conversations happening internally. That idea around what we are counting within to determine sort of our funding FTEs, whether we're taking that from the HESES recreation, whether we are looking at the future of HESES in terms of what we're recording, its longer term future, those are the sorts of things that we want to cover. We are aware that the multiplication factor process has a limited lifespan. That may be a question that's coming in further down. We are looking at how long we can run this. We don't want to run it forever. We want to move to something that is more secure, on a more secure basis as soon as we can. But when we do that, we are of course going to have to put out our proposals and consult on it. So there will be a limited amount of time to when we can do that. We're not sure about HESES24 yet. We need to see if there's enough time to consult on anything, depending on how quickly we can put proposals together. I'd certainly hope beyond that we will be able to move to a more secure footing.
Okay, well, we'll worry about HESES25 when we get there. Okay, thank you. Also on multiplication factors here from a provider, or if you like, two, which have just merged and interested in the likely impact on multiplication factor across the two providers.
So we'll. So I don't know which providers have merged here. We are aware that there were a couple of mergers which happened at the beginning of the academic year, and it may be that that is sort of what we're looking at here. We suspect that, well, obviously depends on the timing of the merger and when that happened. We suspect that for providers that did merge at the beginning of the year, we are anticipating that we will be able to produce updated multiplication factors to reflect that merged data for the two providers combined together. Part of the reason why we launched the HESES workbooks in late October is that then allows us to tie that in with our mini grant announcement. So we'll be doing the usual sort of updates to funding allocations in October, which will reflect things like mergers, any new providers that have come onto the register. So we would expect it to be one single set of multiplication factors for your merged provider. Those, of course, absolutely will be subject to representations process. So if you do not think that there is that they are representative, if there are certain courses that were previously run by one of the provider which aren't going to run under the merged provider, then you can absolutely tell us, and we can make sure that we are considering all of those.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Okay, moving on then. This is one of the ones which was submitted beforehand. Can you please cover accurate reporting of CPD 10 credit courses? CPD continuing professional development, I presume.
Yes, so this is, this is getting into sort of like the quite technical aspects of HESES. If we don't cover this to your satisfaction now, then please do come back to us, and we can pick this up by email, or we can organise a call. Generally, they should be fine to be included in the HESES population. You would, of course, need to make sure that they meet the recognised higher education criteria as being part of the CPD course. Without knowing too much more about the detail, I can't tell you that for certain now. But assuming that they do meet they meet all the usual criteria, they could be recorded in HESES. Student would be recorded as single year of engagement, single head count. With the FTE for those courses would be picked up as part of the multiplication factors process. And in aggregate, that is, if it's new provision, then it might be something that we want to pick up with you, because the sector level information we use might not be representative. It's absolutely the sort of thing we'd want to talk to you about. Yes, I think it's probably one of those things where if you once you can see the data and you know how the HESES work, you've got your HESES workbook. If you have any questions about it, then we're absolutely willing to take those as early as you want to talk to us about it.
Yeah, when I saw this question, I thought it's not quite clear, because obviously there's only so much you can do in a short space, where this I think came through on one of the sign-ups. The sign-up form solicited input for questions, and there's only so much you can do in the space allocated. So my reaction was, this is potentially multiplication factor related, as you've outlined, Ross. But I did wonder if there's any, I'm not aware of any particular change with relation to CPD in terms of whether it meets the definition of higher education. So that's the other possibility, and I don't think there's anything I'm aware of, unless you know differently. No, okay. So as Ross says, if that's not quite what you're getting at there, please write and let us know, and we'll address that. And again, this is kind of off in the practicalities of HESES. This is when somebody has asked for clarification of reporting engagements not active on the census date as they complete before it. So that would be somebody who's finishing their studies, presumably before the census date. So.
Yes, so again, hopefully we cover this sufficiently within the HESES guidance, but we're happy to have a conversation around how you interpret it. The obviously part of this would be that they would need to be starting their year of engagement within the academic year. So they'd have started it by now. Maybe they're only studying for a couple of months and then they're completing it. before the census date, they should be included in the HESES population. They'd be part of column 1, so the years that have started between the 1st of August and the census date. Because they're likely to be part-time, the FTE will be taken into account through the multiplication factors process.
Yeah, okay.
There is some additional information within the guidance, I should note, around what happens if a student withdraws before the census date, which may or may not be relevant here. That's something to check if that is relevant to one of your students.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so it's a difference. Okay, shorter question here, noting that the census date seems to have intentionally been set on a Sunday. And
that's certainly not intentional. That is historical as much as anything, is that we've always maintained the census date, certainly for longer than I've been part of the OFS and HEFGE. Before that, we've always maintained the census dates being the 1st of November and the 1st of December. So we didn't even really clock that it was a Sunday. I don't think we would have changed things because of that. So yeah, there's nothing to read in there.
Right. Okay. Also, sort of in the same sort of operational area, somebody has asked, can you change the terminology of years of engagement? As it still holds meaning of anniversary. Still holds meaning of anniversary to a number of seasoned colleagues across the sector. Years of engagement is more akin to SCS student course session start and end, and are not necessarily a year in length.
Yes, we do recognise that. I mean, I think this was sort of part of what we were considering last year in terms of how we could amend HESES in order to account for the data future specification with things like student course sessions. I do take the point around it still being close to the previous terminology. I don't know if there's that much we can do about that at the moment in terms of changing it. It's one of those things where, you know, we do hideous civil service, well, not actually civil servants, but civil service type meetings where we debate the meanings of individual words. I think years of engagement was the best that we could come up with. If you've got suggestions, we're welcome. We're you know, for new terms, we're happy to hear them. We probably can't change it for this year, of course, but we would be happy to look at it for next year. You are correct in that when we're looking at the way that we define a year of engagement for providers that return data to the DDB, it's a very complicated way of saying that, but effectively, you're not a further education college. Further education colleges still have the ILR specification. Everyone else is kind of our terminology, returns to the DDB. So if you're recording those student course sessions, we do realise that they're not necessarily a year in length, but what we are trying to collect within HESES is we're trying to collect data to be able to use to calculate a funding allocation for a particular year. So we're using student course sessions in order to determine a year of engagement. So we're not saying that the individual student course session is the year of engagement. We're using it as a way of determining what is defined as a year of engagement. It's a bit of an arcane way of defining it. But it does mean that it's a way for us to be able to identify the bit of activity that the student is engaging in that we are using as our volume measure to calculate your share of funding. So I do take the point that some of these bits of terminology can be a bit confusing. We are always open to feedback. If you want to suggest something, please do.
Yes, that's true. Okay. Now looking at this question, Ross, this is, I think you may think differently, but this is perhaps something which might benefit from being taken offline, but we'll see what you think. So somebody's written to ask if a student starts their engagement, and I assume they mean engagement there rather than year of engagement, on the 15th of September 2023, they were in column 1 in HESES 23. Yeah. In 24-25, they have to repeat semester 2. In HESES 24, would they be column 2? In 25-26, their student course session starts in September 25. Would they then be in column 1 in HESES 25?
Yeah, I mean, I can see the question in front of me. I think that Certainly, I mean, if you, this is a sort of question where if you've got specific, it's the sort of thing where if you want to set it out by email and talk through the details with us, we're absolutely happy to do that. We, of course, have our webinar on counting students later next week after, actually, sorry, it's the third webinar that may be helpful. I mean, I think if I'm summarizing this, and I apologize to the questioner if I'm doing it wrong, I think the question is as much as anything is around that idea that these students on this pattern would be changing the way they recorded, the different columns they recorded in between different HESES returns. And that is something that is fine. It was not something that we used to really allow under the old way of recording HESES, but under the current way that we are defining years of engagement, we are aware that because of the way that student course sessions are recorded, this may happen. If that does happen, that is not a problem for us.
Yeah, I think that was certainly my read of what the question was getting at, was that it's about the semester 2 part in the second year of engagement that might get repeated. So to the person who submitted that question, if we haven't quite got the right end of the stick there, do please drop us a line at HESES officestudents.org.uk and let us know, and we can take the finer points of that up with you. So some other questions here. I think we've covered this one. When will the guidance be published?
Next week.
We're hoping that it should be in about a week or so. Question about data futures. Given all of the ongoing issues with HESES data futures again this year and the significantly increased burden, will there be any pushback with the HESES24 submission deadline as there was for the HESES23 return?
So again, we've had some input on the question sheet that we've been using from our data colleagues. We're not aware that there is any significant risk of the HESES deadline being pushed back in the same way as last year. It's obviously something which our data directorate is keeping a very close eye on. We are aware that, so I'm just making sure I summarize this properly. So at the current time, we understand that the process for the collection is on track for the planned schedule. There may be some providers that have extensions, but as far as I'm aware, any extensions are being considered on an individual basis. There aren't any plans for blanket extensions. So there are ongoing discussions around this. If anything does move on this, we would let you know as soon as we could. But as far as we know at the moment, there are not any intentions to move the submission or the submission or sign off deadlines for HESES. It should be going to the currently announced schedule.
Okay, thank you. We had a question in from somebody asking about the particular use of some software, and they were wondering about how it could be set up. So I don't think that's something we can really say much about, is it, Ross?
No, I'm sorry. We can't really. We're not really able to get into the details of what the software that different providers are using can and can't do. You'll probably you would probably get better advice, to be honest, from talking to your colleagues at other providers. So I can see, I think relevant sector bodies would also be able to help, because they will have much more experience in using that software, if nothing else, than us. So I'm sorry we can't help, but hopefully someone will be able to give you a hand with it.
Yeah. So yeah, unfortunately, we don't see the other end of the loop. And a couple more. I think this might be following up something. We had to provide an FTE and other bits or Z aims, which we touched on earlier, for higher apprentices as part of our OFS audit.
Yes. So I mean, again, going from my very helpful support team, they noted that may be due to it. Probably that's an audit requirement for the wider HE population for the assurances that we're gaining here. It's not so that those audits are not just looking at the recognised for OFS funding population. They would be looking at some other things as well. So the audit remit is wider than the funding remit, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And just to backtrack on the previous question about software, one of my colleagues in the back room has suggested that it might be worth posting in the HESPA Statutory Returns Interest Group Forum at HESPA, where you might find kindred spirits who are wrestling with the same software. Another question, which I think is more sort of practical, logistical one, is it possible to see the answers to the previous questions? Well, I think certainly this question, the webinar recording will be online shortly, and you can sort of backtrack there and look at all the responses. But I think we've answered pretty much all of the ones which have been put in. I haven't been able to track all the Q&A as you've been talking, Ross, but I think we've got most of them so far. So let me just, yes, the HESPA suggestion did actually come from one of the attendees. So thank you for that. I'm just looking to see if there's anything that we have missed so far. And I don't think there is anything. As I say, we collate and curate all of these. So if you haven't heard your explicit query that you typed in mentioned, then do please follow up with us by email. Hang on, is there something here? Just a quick question on column 1. It's only the starters between the windows. The census window and any repeat students and new students would be entered into column 2 as last year. Is that still the case?
I think we might want to follow up on that one to make sure we've understood it properly. I mean, when you're whether students are starters or repeating students or continuing students doesn't affect which column they're recorded in, because of course it depends on, it's all to do with when they're starting their year of engagement, and that's true whether it's their first year of engagement or their third year of engagement. So there isn't really a huge difference between those. I think it might be that we need to, it might be helpful to pull that apart with a more full email and example. So I'd ask that you give us a contact, give us a call on HESES and HESES at, and we can pick that up separately.
Yeah, it's column 1 is for those whose student course session, if that's the regime they're operating under. Column 1 is for those where the studies start between the 1st of August and the census date, and column 2 is for those where the student course session starts after the census date up to the following 31st of July. But as Ross says, if that's still not clear, then do please drop us a line and we'll make sure that we've got everything, all of the I's dotted and the T's crossed as far as that goes. Okay, I'm just having a look at both the prompt we use here for the questions and what's coming from our colleagues in the back room, and I can't see anything else at the moment. So I think we're more or less there in terms of questions. As we have said, though, all the way through, if you have further questions, do please drop us a line. So I think we can go back to our slides, and if we can have the next one. Yes, thank you. So as noted earlier, today's session has largely been about those who have had previous sight of HESES. If your colleagues that are new to HESES feel they'd like to test the water, or if they are looking just to have a refresher, then we've got our webinars that you can see here listed, which start next week. So Introduction to IFS Funding is not just about HESES, but it sort of puts HESES in the context of the entire funding model. And that's in exactly a week's time in this slot. And then on Thursday, a couple of days after that, we've got Categorizing Your Students, where we talk about the definitions that we use in a lot more detail. That's followed up following week by Identifying and Counting Students to be included in HESES24. And then a couple of days after that, we talk through the process of submitting your workbook, going through data verification, getting it signed off, and then we'll talk a bit more about the process for multiplication factors, which Ross has been describing. So not too late to register for these events. If you go to officeforstudents.org.uk/events, you can see that link on the screen, and I think it's already been posted in the chat, but people may well be able to do that again, if that would be useful. So next slide, please. Just to reiterate the resources which are available, the main HESES webpage, officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES. That will expand, as I said earlier, as the resources come on stream for this year. Expect to be able to find a link to the guidance there in a week or so. And this is the email address that I've been referring to, HESES@officeforstudents.org.uk. If you've got questions or feedback, do please let us know via that. Next slide, please. So I think that that is everything for today. So thank you for signing up, for listening, and for watching, and for your questions. And if any of you are attending next week, we will see you then. But everybody take care. Thank you.